my great pleasure to welcome everyone here today for a most timely and important discussion before and after U.S. foreign policy and the presidential election by Preble of the Atlantic Council. Let me just ask at this point if you are not, for everyone in the audience to please mute themselves because we're just getting a little bit of background noise. I'm going to just give a very quick welcome. I have a very lengthy bio to introduce our speaker, and I would be remiss if I didn't go through at least a few of the highlights in it. I must begin by saying that this lecture, it is so wonderful to see Chris Preble on the Zoom screen. We had hoped on Monday, March 9th to have him here in person on our campus. In fact, he was within 2 miles of our university campus. And due to COVID, we had to reschedule. And in a million years at that time, I remember someone mentioned the concept of social distancing, which I had never heard before. And of course, that along with muting mics, wearing masks, is the world that we are in now. We are very appreciative that Chris is able to join us today. And we are delighted to have so many participants. Let me give, first and foremost, I have to thank Hofstra's Cultural Center, particularly Kathleen Collins and Carol Mallison, for orchestrating everything to make this event possible. My colleagues, Carolyn Eisenberg in the History Department and Marty Melkonian in Economics, who are moderating this event with me. This event is co-sponsored by the Calico Center and Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement's International Scene Lecture Series. And we are so glad to have such a wide range of audiences participating. I also want to give a special welcome to Professor Kari Jensen's Global Studies class that is joining us today. Thank you, Professor Jensen. Professor Eisenberg's history class, and my own first year cluster American politics class who are actually in the classroom. You can't see them all, but we actually decided we wanted to convene for this session even with masks on. So it's a real pleasure, and that's in fact why I am wearing my mask. Thank you, Professor Jensen, for I couldn't remember your class name, so thank you for writing in India and its neighbors. I knew it had changed recently. That's why I went over that. Allow me to introduce our guest speaker. Chris Preble is co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. In that role, Dr. Preble leads a team of scholars who challenge prevailing assumptions about U.S. foreign policy and who offer a range of policy options that go beyond the use of force and coercion. Dr. Preble's own work focuses on the history of U.S. foreign policy, contemporary U.S. grant strategy and military force posture, alliance relations, and the intersection of trade and national security. Dr. Preble is the author of 4 books, including most recently, Peace, War, and Liberty, Understanding U.S. Policy, The Power Problem, How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free. His work has appeared, in addition to his scholarly research, his work has appeared in numerous national publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, National Review, and he is a frequent speaker on television and radio, and Zoom now. In addition to his work at the Atlantic Council, Dr. Preble co-hosts the Net Assessment podcast in the War on the Rocks network. He also teaches the U.S. Foreign Policy elective at the University of California, Washington Center, the internship organization located in DC. He has taught history at St. Cloud State University and Temple University. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Before he joined the Atlantic Council, Dr. Preble was Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, and previously Director of Foreign Policy Studies there. Before his academic career, Dr. Preble was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Navy, and he served aboard the USS Ticonderoga from 1990 to 1993. He's a graduate of George Washington University, and he earned his PhD in history from Temple University in 2002. And I see, Dr. Preble, that you wrote at the end of this bio way more than you need. The first paragraph would suffice, but we would be remiss if we did not take the time to recognize your wide-ranging, deep, and extensive expertise in American foreign policy. I should also say that we have had the pleasure of having Dr. Preble speak at Hofstra many times. We were just saying, I think the last time was for a conference from Votes to Victory, winning the White House in 2008, which was April 2008. Seems like another world. At this point in time, I'm going to turn the floor over to our guest speaker. After that, Dr. Eisenberg, Professor Melkonian, and I will moderate a Q&A, and then we will ensure plenty of time for audience questions through the chat, please. But for now, everyone, if you would please mute your mics, we will turn the floor over to Dr. Preble. Thank you. Chris, please.
Great, thanks, Mina. It's great to be here. I wish I were there. You all understand what I mean by that. I'm so grateful to Hofstra, to the Calico Center, to the Center for Civic Engagement for the invitation to speak. And I promise someday to return in person to Hofstra and visit again. I'm going to go through a series of slides, but I want to leave a lot of time for questions. I expect to be sufficiently provocative that I will get people's attention and elicit questions. So with that, we'll jump right into it. And you know, to do away with the dramatic effect, if you know the old expression, bottom line up front, I think regardless of who wins the election in November, major change in foreign policy is unlikely. And I think that that's likely, that some people are going to be surprised by that. So let me just explain why that is. Partly because foreign policy is not a top priority. It's not a top priority for most Americans, and it's not a top priority, therefore, for either of the two major candidates, Vice President Biden and President Trump. But more importantly, there are severe constraints that make it very hard to change U.S. foreign policy, even if people wanted to. Obviously, the political polarization, which we've seen developing in this country over a number of years, our fragile economy, which has been knocked off, obviously off its game, especially by COVID-19. But there were also longer-term fiscal pressures that were impinging upon the ability of the United States to maintain a very large and active military and a very active U.S. foreign policy around the world. And that coincides with a more contested international environment. Now, I think that we could talk about, if you're interested, there are pros and cons to more capable and empowered actors around the world. My argument is that some of those capable and empowered actors are American allies and partners, and in fact, we're going to have to work more closely with them in the future. But we also know of some countries who are challenging not just U.S. power, but the international order more generally, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So the reason why change is unlikely is because change is hard. Just ask President Trump, and I think if you go back to candidate Trump's major foreign policy address back in April of 2016, it was really a remarkable statement, and I think coming out of that speech, no one could doubt his sort of animosity, frankly, towards the U.S. foreign policy establishment. Words like foolishness and arrogance, foreign policy disaster, people with perfect resumes, but a long history of failure. That was a focus of the speech, but he also promised famously to put U.S. interests above those of other countries, as he expected other countries to do the same. Of course, the shorthand of that is America first. And I think in order to really understand what candidate Donald Trump was getting at, it's useful to just dwell for a few minutes on what was that status quo that he was running against. Generally speaking, it's called primacy. Other words are used, but back at the beginning of the post-Cold War era, the famous political scientist Samuel Huntington coined the term primacy, and I think it's still works pretty well. The bottom line is that the object of US foreign policy coming out of the Cold War was to prevent the reemergence of any potential rival that was capable of challenging US power anywhere in the world. In that included in Western Europe, included in Asia, or the territory of the former Soviet Union. Notably, we weren't just talking about resurgent Russia back then, or we weren't even talking about China. We were also talking about US allies and partners like Germany and Japan. The notion that these countries might someday challenge the United States for dominance in their region or globally was seen as a great danger and something that US foreign policy really tried to stamp out. So primacy just hinges on this notion of a large, expansive, and globally deployed military. It's going to stop potential threats before they emerge or smother them if they flame up. And generally speaking, the establishment just was sort of skeptical that other countries were in a strong position to defend themselves, and their interest would be better for the United States essentially to do it for them. Another way to think about this, just the two sort of basic elements, is the United States is responsible for maintaining peace in the world, and as I said, this requires a large military. So the essence of American power is its military power more than its economic power or its cultural influence. A couple quotes from sort of general under primacy, quote, only a preponderance of US power ensures peace, or peace, according to another defender of the status quo that Donald Trump was assailing, peace is the result of an imbalance of power in which US capabilities are sufficient, operating on their own to cow all potential challengers and comfort all coalition partners. So it really hinges on this notion that US foreign policy is not dedicated strictly or primarily on the defense of the United States and its vital interests, but on the safety and security of the entire world. Hence, the dramatic departure, we would think, from Donald Trump's pledge to focus on America first. And I think it's also useful to just dwell for a minute on when we talk about the international order, what are we really talking about? Broadly speaking, that's a liberal one, not progressive liberal in domestic context, but liberal as in things like an open trading system, adherence to certain rules and norms. This is not the law of the jungle, but the law of law, and these are buttressed by institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank or alliances like NATO, things like that. And also another key element of the support of the liberal order, the international order that was created after the Second World War and that the United States has tried to uphold over the years is support for democracy. So if you think of the international order under those terms, you can sort of anticipate how it is that a Donald Trump in charge of the country supposedly responsible for upholding that liberal order might pose a threat to it. For example, I've already mentioned Donald Trump as candidate, and then President Trump was focused on American security, not global security. He was skeptical of the notion of collective defense. He was skeptical and has been for decades, skeptical of the benefits of global trade and focused much more on a sort of mercantilist approach to trade. He saw international rules and norms as mostly limiting America's ability to do what it saw as necessary, and therefore was not generally supportive of that. And he's also demonstrated a sort of ambivalence or disinterest in the idea of promoting democracy around the world. So if you know those things about Donald Trump as a candidate and as a person, coming into sort of emerging from his election in November of 2016, you might expect, and again, he said that this was his intention, you might expect there to be major changes. And I've been paying pretty close attention, as you can imagine. It's my job to pay attention to these things. And my argument is that not as much has changed as you might actually think. One way to do this is to compare side by side President Obama's last national security strategy, which came out in February 2015, and President Trump's national security strategy, which was issued in December of 2017. If you compare side by side these two documents, there are some notable differences. As you can imagine, there was a lot more references to trade and immigration in the Trump national security strategy. Donald Trump, in addition to his skepticism of trade, has repeatedly stressed his resistance or even hostility towards immigration into the United States, seeing that as a source of weakness, not a source of strength. So that's a key difference between himself and President Obama. Again, more skepticism about trade as a net benefit for the United States. A few other things that you might expect to see in terms of differences. There are many more references to terrorism in the national security strategy of 2017, and especially to Islamist terrorism. In fact, the word Islamist appears 7 times in the 2017 national security strategy and 0 times in the 2015 strategy. So there are some differences, but there are also some interesting similarities, including sort of the structure of the two documents around 4 key pillars. One of the differences that President Trump emphasized is on the need for a big military. Again, this went back to his campaign where he promised to grow military spending. And you saw that in the National Defense Strategy that was released just a few months after the National Security Strategy, an unclassified version of it. There was a classified version that I haven't seen, but they released a sort of summary document for public consumption. And the basic gist of this document is that the United States is going to have to spend a lot more on its military in order to maintain our competitive advantage, in order to maintain primacy. If you remember what I said a few minutes ago about the importance of military dominance to sustaining primacy as a strategy, it goes hand in hand with this national defense strategy. If you look at the actual level of spending under President Obama's, during President Obama's 8 years in office and what we see in the first 3 years of President Trump's military budget, you do see an increase in spending. Of course, some of the downturn in military spending in the early teens was attributed to or associated with the sharp decline in U.S. military forces fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. So a lot of the decline can be explained by that. But on the other hand, you could argue that relative to sort of based on what candidate Trump and early President Trump was saying, you might even see larger increases than we did. And again, I can get into that a little bit if you're interested. I went back and I looked, this is sort of an interesting historical document now, and Professor Bose mentioned, how much has changed in 6 months, and we don't remember things like social distance. We didn't know anything about social distancing or things like that back in March of 2020. In February of 2020, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper released the Trump administration's request for the 2021 budget year, and it was for $740 billion. Here's some of the, and it's full spectrum dominance or dominance across every domain. That's what I've tried to show here. And in addition to the $740 billion, let's not forget that we have over $100 billion that we spend to take care of our veterans. And in addition to that, we have things like the Department of Homeland Security and other things. So the United States is spending an extraordinary amount on the military already. And that hasn't changed, or at least not yet, despite the COVID crisis and the downturn in the economy. And again, I'll come back to that in a minute. So to sum up this part of my argument is that we have not seen a dramatic change in the U.S. military posture around the world. We have not seen a great sort of withdrawal as some might have thought. Even the President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal, I think, signals a greater involvement, or at least the risk of greater involvement in the U.S. and the Middle East rather than less involvement. I do want to spend just a few minutes talking about the war in Afghanistan. I know that Professor Jensen, his class, is interested in this question, and I just want to spend just a few minutes on that question because I think it's an interesting sort of vignette into how President Trump has actually governed. Back in August 2017, one of the first major speeches he gave on Afghanistan was sort of explaining his sentiments coming into office, his sense that this war had gone on too long, recognizing the American people were very tired of the conflict and very frustrated by the lack of tangible results. And so he explained that, of course, his instinct, as he promised, was to get out, but ultimately he chose not to get out because the people who had fought in the war so far deserved to win as opposed to simply leave without winning. The concern that, as had occurred, he said, in Iraq, the vacuum would be filled by by bad actors, and asserting that the threats that we faced in Afghanistan were still just too grave for the United States to walk away. So rather than walking away, he announced a pretty substantial increase in U.S. military personnel in Afghanistan. The totals were up to about 15 or 16,000 by the end of 2017, considerably more than when he came into office. Just in the last few weeks, if you're paying attention, there have been some news, but really this started in earnest. Oop, I went forward one slide too many. President Trump visited Afghanistan back around Thanksgiving of last year, and there was an announcement of a peace deal between the United States and the Taliban in February of 2020. What's important to remember about that peace agreement was that was between the United States and the Taliban, not involving the Afghan government. Troop withdrawals began not long after that announced peace deal, and there have been some reports that the president would like to draw down to as low as 4,000 by election day, which would be fewer than when he took office. But as of right now, there are more troops in Afghanistan than in January of 2017. Just over the past weekend, in fact, on Sunday, the Taliban and Afghan governments met for the first time in Doha, Qatar, and they are in the midst of pretty difficult negotiations concerning the future of the state of Afghanistan, what the character of that state will be, and how that will proceed after an eventual U.S. withdrawal. Now, you might notice that I'm supposed to be talking about the U.S. presidential election, and I've spent most of my time talking about only one candidate. And in my defense, the reason why is because I go back to what I said at the beginning. I don't expect there to be major changes in U.S. foreign policy, even if Vice President Biden is elected in November, because ultimately Vice President Biden and the folks around him are committed to the notion of primacy as the status quo, and as President Trump has found very difficult to change. That was my instinct. Fortuitously, just as I was preparing my slides last week, there was a story in Stars and Stripes where Vice President Biden reaffirms that his intention is to maintain a small force in the Middle East and no plans for major defense cuts. I just want to pause for a minute on this defense cuts question, because again, I think it might strike some people as interesting. Of course, the Democrats control the House, and that's where spending bills originate. And the Democratic-controlled House Armed Services Committee passed unanimously a $740.5 billion defense authorization. This is several months after the COVID crisis hit, and yes, that's exactly the same amount that Secretary Esper and the Pentagon requested before the depths of the COVID crisis were apparent. So my argument is that the inertia behind continued high military spending is quite strong, and there's no evidence that Vice President Biden or the folks around him are committed to dramatically reducing U.S. military spending and reorienting U.S. foreign policy. Again, we could talk a little bit about why that is. I've dug into this in some detail over the years, including most recently in a book that I co-authored with two of my Cato colleagues, John Glazer and Trevor Thrall. Just quickly, I'll wrap up here and then happy to take questions. Why is it so hard to change U.S. foreign policy if we think that those changes are necessary? The first is that people are policy. If you've ever heard that expression, it's true. If you have even someone like Donald Trump, who is interested in changing things, he populates his administration with people who are committed more or less to the status quo, then you're not going to get change. I think we saw that, especially in the early stages of President Trump's administration, and those folks reflected the dominant foreign policy consensus on primacy and therefore were unlikely to change it. And by the same token, as I've indicated, the people around Vice President Biden are also generally committed to the idea of primacy. One difference, of course, if it's true that people are policy, in the Trump administration, person is policy. And so it is true that one person, Donald Trump, can make much more of an impact than perhaps the usual politician. But let's be clear, he is an amateur, he is distracted, he doesn't understand the policy-making process, and it will require an enormous amount of effort and attention on his part to actually make a change. And I'm not convinced that he was as serious about making that change as he claimed to be. Two other explanations, and then I'll take questions. In addition to inertia, which is a very important force in the universe, it's a very important force in politics and policy as well. So I think there's a fair amount to be explained on why we haven't seen dramatic change. You can attribute that to things like inertia and, or as my friend Patrick Porter calls it, habit, the habits of doing business and conducting policy. Another explanation is that primacy is the correct strategy. And so notwithstanding not just Donald Trump's profession of wanting to change direction on US foreign policy, but you could argue that Barack Obama also wanted to change the direction of US foreign policy when he was elected in 2008 and generally failed to do so. You could argue that George W. Bush, who professed to want to pursue a humble foreign policy, he also didn't do so. Again, we can talk about the details on why that might have been, but some people would argue that primacy is right, and when people figure out that that's the case, they back away from their campaign promises. I don't think that's accurate. I think it's a debatable proposition. That's a big part of what the New American Engagement Initiative is set up to do. But I think it's a timely moment. In addition to the existing sort of structural changes that were going on in the international system, in the international economy, the U.S. share of the global economy is shrinking in relative terms. Public sentiment here in the United States is very much wanting to focus on problems at home, and that was before coronavirus hit. That was before people recognized that the money that was going into military spending was not particularly useful in fighting a pandemic disease. As I like to say, COVID-19 doesn't care how many aircraft carriers you have. So I think I'll close there. I intended to go until about 10 o'clock, and I will turn it over to our many capable moderators to field questions and go from there. Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for encapsulating so much material in such a short time. I
hope I wasn't going too fast.
No, not at all. We wanted to have time for questions, and I think what we're going to do in just a moment is I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Professors Eisenberg and Melkonian, and Professor Jensen, if you'd like to ask a question as well before we open it up, we'd certainly like to welcome that. Dr. Eisenberg, I'm just going to take the liberty of asking the first question, so I still have the mic, just to ask Dr. Preble to just say a little bit more about the challenge of combating the inertia or the habits of high military spending. I know this is I'm not asking this in a scholarly way, it's more of a public way, but you know, when you look at the amount of 740.5 billion, right, and thinking about even the sums of what a 5% cut would entail and how that, but the battles that would take place, so that even if we're to discuss any sort of larger sort of cut, the challenge of combating the fear of something going right, something happening. So I'm just, if you would just say a little bit about that, I appreciate your thoughts.
Sure, it's a great question, Professor Bose. I think that there are two distinct challenges with cutting military spending. One, which I think is becoming less urgent over time, and the other that arguably is becoming harder. The first has to do with the economic effects of military spending cuts in the United States, something that I studied a lot in the context of the Cold War, and I continue to study in my time at Cato and now at the Atlantic Council. The simple fact is that $740 billion is a lot of money, and that's, if you focus on the dollars, it is just that. As a share of the U.S. economy, military spending has been in a relatively slow and steady decline for decades now. As you know, I studied the sort of middle Cold War period, the 1950s and 1960s, and when Dwight Eisenhower left office and he complained about the military-industrial complex, military spending constituted about 10% of the U.S. economy, and now it's about 3% right So in those terms, you can see how a 10% cut to 3% of the economy is a lot less disruptive than a 10% cut to 10% of the economy. I'm not even a math whiz, but I can do that on the back of an envelope, right? And so I do think that there is a sense still among many political leaders, elected officials, that cutting defense spending will have a devastating impact on local economies and therefore be politically damaging for those who support it. I don't think that's true, but I think it's a contestable proposition. The most recent time in which we debated this was in the early teens when I showed the chart where US military spending did come down. It was mostly, again, because of the drawdowns in Iraq and Afghanistan and numbers of troops. At that time, there were dire warnings that military spending cuts would send the US economy into a deep recession or worse. That did not occur. And so I think we've had a fairly recent case in which military spending cuts did not lead to economic harm, and yet the political fears are real and we continue to have to argue against them, sort of argue the point, those of us who are making the case for redirecting and reorienting US foreign policy away from the use of force towards diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. The other point has to do, is I think a harder problem, which is that many Americans still see the US military as a particularly useful instrument of American influence, whereas the other tools that we might call upon are not so easily wielded or are not so effective. Now, I think in that respect, it's useful to focus on generational divides, because the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe that the US military is the greatest and most effective instrument of American foreign policy. So this may be just a generational shift that's going on, that the folks who grew into adulthood, those of you who I'm speaking to right now, who really know nothing other than US military operations in the post 9/11 era, have reason to doubt the utility of the use of force because we've not seen a lot of sort of shining successes. There haven't been great victory parades or ticker tape parades in Times Square. And that's what the earlier generations recall of the US military and its effectiveness in the wars of World War II, for example, or again, Korea and Vietnam sort of cast a pall on that as well. So I think it's a great question. I think about it a lot. I think the key is to focus on the efficacy of the use of the military, get away from seeing US military spending as a economic stimulus, and therefore that cutting military spending and redirecting some of those resources to other purposes would actually generate more and better economic activity than continuing to invest in sort of legacy military technology.
Okay. I'm so tempted to ask follow-ups that I'm going to cede it over to my colleagues. So I do thank you. Thank you, Chris. I do see some questions coming up in the chat. We're going to hold off just so everyone knows. We will respond. I will repeat the audience questions in a few moments, but we're going to start with a few questions from our moderators. So Professors Eisenberg and Melkonian, why don't I turn it over to both of you? And then we'll ask Professor Jensen as well if she has a question before we open it up to audience Q&A. And let me just also say, Dr. Preble, we are leaving the screen share on for you so that if someone asks a question, you want to turn back to a slide. If you want to leave it here or keep it on your first slide, we'll keep it. I think that's easiest.
Okay, yep.
Professor Eisenberg?
Yes, I guess, I was thinking, hi, Chris, and thank you for joining us. And you've been speaking out on these issues for a very, very long time. But as you were speaking, I was thinking of all the horrible things that are happening this minute, right? Including the pandemic, 3 states threatened by wildfires, right. A negligent president, and so forth. And I think in that context that one of the reasons, it's certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons that the issue of military spending and the defense appropriation bill, et cetera, has not gotten a lot of attention is because there are all these other very obviously dangerous situations that are, people are worried about the pandemic, right? You weren't even allowed to speak here because of this pandemic. Right. My question, though, is can you say a little bit about what you think are the dangers of this excessive reliance on the military that has been true of U.S. policy before Trump? I don't know whether you would argue that it's less so now, but your work has been animated by that. So what, you know, why is it harmful? Why should people care about it?
Right. So thank you, Carolyn. For those of you who don't know, and Professor Bose mentioned one of my earlier books, The Power Problem. Professor Eisenberg was not kind enough to write a blurb for that book, so she knows my work very, very well. And we don't have time to go into that entire book, but that's basically the gist of her question. Why is it that the subtitle of my previous book is accurate? Why American military dominance makes us less safe, less prosperous, and less free? And the short answer is, and I have to emphasize, I mean, I served in the U.S. military proudly. I know what the U.S. military is capable of, and I believe that the U.S. military is still a critical instrument of American power, but I believe that the United States relies on it too much. I believe that because the use of force is simply not relevant with respect to many of the challenges that we face today and are likely to face in the future. And we are over-investing in that one instrument and under-investing in other tools. I guess just as an aside, I just saw this. I shouldn't quote headlines without reading stories, but I recall seeing a headline, I guess it was about a week ago, that you know, firefighting planes in Oregon were in Afghanistan. For example, you know, there is a zero-sum element to this, where if you're investing resources in one place, you cannot spend that same dollar somewhere else, or the opportunity cost, as the economists would say. So that's a big focus of my work, is saying that we are by over-investing in the U.S. military, that is that its effectiveness is waning. We are missing an opportunity to invest in more useful instruments elsewhere. But I also believe that the use of the military concentrates power into the hands of the executive branch, contrary to the intentions of the founder and the text of the Constitution, that Congress was supposed to be a co-equal branch with the president with respect to the conduct of foreign policy, but because the president as commander-in-chief is able to wield the military without Congress's effective sort of approval, that has shifted power, I think, in a very dangerous way and ultimately harmful to liberty here at home. The last point is, and I think we have to be honest about this, when the United States uses force abroad, it can engender resistance and even violence directed against the United States. That is not always the case, but that is sometimes the case. And so I think we have to take account of those instances in which when the use of force, even when well-intentioned, which I think it often is, has unhappy and potentially dangerous unintended consequences. And so for all of those reasons, I think that that's why the military instrument, while still an important one, needs to be de-emphasized in American foreign policy. And again, I would emphasize myself the importance of good old-fashioned diplomacy, negotiations, compromise. I would stress the importance of trade, and also the cultural exchange that goes along with people visiting foreign countries, traveling as business people or as students. Those kinds of things are also instruments of American power, and I think they are ultimately more effective than the military tool by itself. Thank
you, Chris. I have 4 more questions, but I think the moderators here are going crazy. Let me just defer to Professor Melkonian for a minute, and then I think give him a chance to ask the question before I ask 4 more, and then we'll turn to the audience.
That sounds good. Thanks, Professor Eisenberg. Professor Melkonian, please.
Chris, I was wondering how realistic it is, in your opinion, to stick to the idea of dominance or primacy in the face of, say, the history of the 21st century, namely various failures in Iraq and Syria and Libya, and the other challenges we're facing, namely the pandemics and climate change, which are going to require vast sums of money to deal with at a time when so much of our resources are directed to the military.
Right. Excellent question, sir. I think a reasonable case can be made by the defenders of primacy that while America's share of global economic output is declining in relative terms, our allies and partners combined with the United States still constitute a dominant share of global economic output. So in other words, if you focus not solely on the US share, but also our allies and partners, then you could have continue to have an international order that was undergirded by US primacy with allies and partners supporting US primacy. So that's a reasonable case to be made. I think the concern is that as US allies and partners grow more capable, there will inevitably be instances in which our interests diverge from theirs. This is not a moral failing on their part. It's simply the fact that countries have divergent interests from time to time. And how you manage those divergent interests, I think, is critical. And again, why diplomacy is such an important notion. What we are trying to stress, and my co-director Matt Burrows at the Atlantic Council with me, we are really stressing the importance of an American leadership that listens to allies and partners, that is mindful of their interests, their concerns. Some might describe that as a kinder, gentler form of primacy. Matt and I describe it more traditionally as a return to multipolarity, a notion that there will be many capable actors on the global scene, and that together those various actors should work together to deal with common challenges, including, as you note, things that are transnational threats like pandemic disease or climate change or things like that. But I've tried to represent fairly the position of those who would continue to make the case for primacy, and that's how they would do it. Is they say that the United States, being able to rely on allies and partners who have considerable capabilities, would allow us to sustain that position for a generation or more.
Okay. Thank you. I'd like to turn to Professor Jensen to see if she would like to ask a question. Or Marty, did you have a follow-up, or is that okay?
Sure, that's fine. I have a couple of questions, but I'll wait until Professor Jensen.
Yeah, okay. So I'll defer. At some point, I have a few questions coming in on the chats too, but okay. So Professor Jensen, I don't know if you would like to do a question on the chat, or if you want to unmute, but we'll turn it over to you. Oh, you're
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So thank you, Dr. Bose, and thank you, Dr. Preble, very much for coming to Hofstra, sort of. And well, I just wanted to share with you that my 37 students and we have been reading at least some of the so-called Afghan papers published in Washington Post last December.
Yes.
And well, I will let my students speak for themselves, but I can at least say that I was shocked and angry, although I felt that I kind of knew most of the main issues from before, but just reading it with all those statements from people who have actually been there, and yeah, both on the US side and the Afghan side, it really makes an impression. So I highly recommend everybody to read the Afghan papers from Washington Post December last year. My question to you, Dr. Preble, is along the lines of what can we do to make sure that the American public actually knows what is going on in the countries where the US is interfering, and especially in the countries where it is so dramatic, and we have been there for so long, and the American public seems to know nothing or not care. So I'm thinking, for example, about projects such as the Coast of War, carried out by Brown University with Catherine Lutz, for example, who we read a short article by her emphasizing that, of course, the US wars will go on because it is so darn profitable for big corporations. And we don't hear those things. We don't hear the main crucial things. We don't get through mainstream media, which obviously has to do with who is owning the shares of the mainstream media and all of that. But my focus is more like, how can we keep some optimism by focusing on what we can do differently to make the American public aware, so
Right.
that they will care and so that change can be made.
Thank you, Professor Jensen, and your class for that question. I've given this a lot of thought, and it relates to something I said a few minutes ago in response to Professor Eisenberg, which is the founders intended that Congress would be a co-equal branch of government with respect to the conduct of foreign policy. That imposes a particular burden, a responsibility on elected officials to represent their constituents on matters of foreign policy. I agree with you that the Afghanistan papers were a very important set of documents. We should note that the Washington Post doesn't get much more mainstream media than the Washington Post. So the US mainstream media, for all of the criticisms leveled at it, occasionally, and I would argue even often, gets things right if we were willing to listen. But then what do you do with this information? And I think, frankly, it requires members of Congress, the more senior, the better, to take seriously their responsibility to ask questions. I convened a panel of historians about a year ago, a little over a year ago, looking at how the United States managed to extricate itself from Vietnam with all of the attendant challenges that had, and whether or not we could learn anything from how we were going to extricate ourselves from Afghanistan. And as and so there were the Vietnam papers, the Pentagon papers that was sort of the analog to the Afghan papers, but also the Fulbright hearings. J. William Fulbright, the senator from Arkansas and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was a complicated man, and there were many things about his past that I am not at all supportive of, and yet he was an ally of President Johnson and challenged President Johnson at a critical moment in the Vietnam War, and was willing to call to testify individuals who he knew would challenge the administration's case for not merely persisting in Vietnam, but even escalating the conflict. And I search nearly in vain for anyone in Congress today who is willing to take what was at the time a very difficult political position for Senator Fulbright. And I think any member of Congress, but especially anyone in the Senate, and especially any committee chairperson in the Senate, either of the main committees or the subcommittees, has the authority and indeed the responsibility to call hearings. And that's where I think it would start. Because I agree with you, the Cost of War Project is an extraordinary resource. I rely on it quite a bit. I also do rely on the Washington Post, the New York Times, and other of the mainstream media. But at the end of the day, the people who are able to bring to light the details of the conduct of US foreign policy and to call and hold accountable those responsible for conducting US foreign policy, those are members of Congress. And that's where I think a lot of the responsibility lies.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Thank you for the resources that have been raised for finding information, as well as discussing how.
I should mention, and I meant to do that, I meant to put it into the chat. My colleague Lauren Sander and I wrote an article in the online journal War on the Rocks, focusing on Senator Fulbright, the role that he played in shining light on the war in Vietnam at a critical moment. So if you Google that, Preble and Fulbright, I don't think there's anything else I've written on Senator Fulbright, so it's probably the only thing that will pop up.
Great, thank you. Professors Melkonian and Eisenberg, we have, so I have at least now, both in the chat that everyone sees and in the private chats, I have 5 questions from the audience so far, and I'm sure there will be more. Would either of you like to ask, as the organizers of this event, would you like to ask another Dr. Eisenberg, one of your four, or Professor Melkonian a follow-up before we open up for audience discussion?
I've been inclined, speaking for myself, I'm inclined to defer. I now have 7 questions, but I'm inclined to defer for the moment, either with Professor Melkonian has a follow-up or opening it up to students, and then I'd like to come back towards the end. Okay,
Professor Melkonian?
I have a very quick question that might require a very long answer. Namely, we're facing, I think, several existential threats, including unintended nuclear war and global climate catastrophe, which could end life as we know it. My problem is that if we continue with the status quo, as is being suggested, how will that lead to dealing with these issues that are so crucial over the next several years?
You're right. That's a short question demanding a long answer. Let me give a medium-length answer. I think we have frankly abused the notion of an existential threat, such that genuinely existential threats become sort of lumped together. We should remember that too many people after 9/11 declared terrorism to be an existential threat to the nation. I spent many years and tens of thousands of words trying to debunk that notion without great success. Now the existential threat is China is replacing Islamic terrorism as the threat that folks are supposed to be obsessed over. But I think that as you point out, Professor Melkonian, the danger of a conventional conflict escalating to a nuclear exchange is ever present and likely will be for as long as those weapons exist. And also relevant is the importance of cooperating to deal with transnational threats like climate change and pandemic disease. So all I can say, and I'll admit that it's not particularly optimistic, but it's all I have, is that there are sensible voices, both here in the United States and around the world, that recognize the dangers of nuclear proliferation and nuclear use. We were fortunate, and I think that's the best way to describe it. We were fortunate that there was not a nuclear exchange during the first Cold War. I would urge people who look nostalgically upon the first Cold War and imagine that a second Cold War with China would be wonderful and fun. Again, I'd recommend my colleague Matt Burrows, who wrote a piece for the Atlantic Council on the nostalgia around the Cold War, and we shouldn't wish to repeat that because the nuclear weapons still exist, but also a need in a cooperative fashion with other countries to deal with transnational threats. And I think that there are a not insignificant number of voices who recognize the importance of addressing these other challenges. And again, some hope that the younger you are, the more likely you are to think that those approaches are worth trying. No pressure. Those of you under the age of, I don't know, I'm 53 today. Nina has reminded me that I'm 53 today. So if you're under the age of 40, you have your work cut out for you. I'll give a break to those to the Gen Xers among us, but millennials and below, you're on the clock.
Well, Chris, I'm sure I wasn't going to bring up your birthday, though I said it earlier, but happy birthday. And we know there's nothing else you'd rather be doing than discussing U.S. foreign policy. So
you're right. You're absolutely right.
I'm going to, if it's okay, Professors Melkonian and Eisenberg, I'm going to start doing some of the student questions. Good? Yeah? Okay. So we're getting several questions coming through in the chat. I'm going to start with actually, I think it will be easiest if people put questions into the chat. You may do them directly to me. I'm getting some of those, and we will try to get to them. I'm going to try to consolidate a few questions in this first one, Chris. I'm going to start with defense budget. and then move to alliances. So we've gotten 3 questions that have come in on the defense budget. One, a very specific question: if we're spending enough to defend the United States against cyber warfare. No small issue, as we are 7 weeks from election day.
Right.
Second, a question about our spending on protecting the United States. Why should the United States be spending to be the world police? And should we should we be using our financial military resources in other ways? And then a third question that is actually a counter to that. So I know this is a big part, but I want to just consolidate them. If we cut military spending, what would be the reaction from the smaller countries that the United States defends, and domestically, people who this gets to the economics issue that you raised before, people at home who support the U.S. budget. So a 3-part question there, if you would.
Right. So let me deal with the cyber question first, and relatively quickly. Not that it's a small matter, but I think I have a short answer, and that is, while a proportion of the U.S. military budget should be focused on defending U.S. military assets from cyber attack, and defending the infrastructure of the U.S. military, which relies heavily on cyberspace, all of us as individuals are spending far, far more than the U.S. government ever will to defend ourselves in cyberspace. Because, well, if you're like me and you have the little McAfee symbol on your laptop, which is flashing to say that I haven't renewed yet, I need to do that. And that's not an ad for McAfee, by the way, because I've used Norton in the past. But this is a serious point. I think that there is a recognition, when you step back and you think about the danger of cyber threats, that there are many actors who have a responsibility to defend against cyber threats. Don't open that attachment from someone you don't know, or all the things that we've learned about cyber. And actually, there's an interesting parallel which we've learned with respect to COVID, is we have a shared responsibility to protect ourselves from pandemic disease, because if we do not, then we are spreading and making the problem worse. So I think that the country as a whole, the nation, is spending a lot to defend against cyber. Some share of that is appropriately in the Defense Department. I could make a case that some of the investment in legacy systems should be directed and diverted into other things. Legacy systems, I'm thinking about ships and planes and things like that, into new technologies and to deal with new threats. That's a separate discussion. But I think we have to recognize that cyber is an all hands on deck, pardon the Navy metaphor. And I think, generally speaking, that Americans recognize that. So let's talk. So that's the question on cyber, which is a good one. Let me address the second question, which has to do with can we afford to be the world's police, or can we afford not to? Because really, that's what this comes down to. And my contention is that U.S. allies and partners who, when the United States initiated many of the alliances that persist to this day, were broken and broke. Okay, if we're thinking about the countries of Western Europe, and we're thinking about Korea and Japan in particular, these countries were not in a strong position to defend themselves from foreign dangers in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. That is no longer the case today. These countries are quite capable and inclined to do so. And then the question becomes, therefore, do we actually want them to do more to defend themselves from harm, or do we believe that them taking such actions would be a greater danger than us to continue to underwrite their security, whether it's the world policeman or whatever metaphor you want to use. And again, I believe that in an emerging multipolar world, more capable actors are generally a good thing. I think that most countries of the world recognize the benefits of global trade. They recognize the dangers of war in a nuclear environment. They understand the need, as I recently mentioned, the need to deal with transnational threats in a cooperative fashion. They are still committed to principles of diplomacy and negotiation and compromise. And so for all of those reasons, I think the United States should be transitioning to more burden sharing is the common word or concept. But it's not a new idea. This goes back to the founding of the NATO alliance, for example. The question of how much do U.S. policymakers expect allies and partners to contribute their own defense. And I think there is an emerging consensus that whereas once U.S. officials were quite wary of other countries taking on more defense burdens, I think there's an emerging consensus that now it would be not merely to our benefit, but also to their benefit to do so. And I think that's an important transition. I think we shouldn't sort of skip past that because it was an important concession on the part of those who were quite fearful for a number of years that greater self-reliance on the part of U.S. allies and partners would be a great danger. And I think fewer and fewer people believe that today.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Let me just say we're getting some excellent questions in the chat. Some of them are from students I know who are either identifying as students themselves or I know them. And let me just ask my colleagues, please keep a track of, if you're keeping track of who's asking questions, please look at that in the chat because I'm not going to identify people by name, though many of them are doing it. If you're, and in my class, I'm looking at all of you here, even though I'm focused on the Zoom, if you have a question as well, please put it in the chat, okay? And we'll get to you. Okay. The next question, actually, Chris, focuses on alliances, and I'm glad that you brought up NATO because I've gotten a couple of questions on this. And let me combine them. One is about President Trump's going it alone philosophy, the kind of the Trump administration's lack of interest in partners for foreign policy, or maybe more of a transactional approach, the withdrawing from the global initiative to deal with global warming, withdrawing from the Iran agreement, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then along with that, a student asked a similar question. We had a Zoom event with officers from the Army War College last spring. This was actually supposed to be a full university event. It ended up being a class event because we couldn't have it on campus. But in that discussion, Army War College officers stressed the largely ignored importance of partnerships and alliances. The president has repeatedly attacked U.S. allies, withdrawn from the partnerships that I just mentioned, even if they weren't always concerned with global security. Would a Biden presidency be different in this regard? So alliances generally and contrasting Trump and Biden.
Right, great question. So let me be very clear. I do believe that in matters of tone, at a minimum, President Biden would be far more respectful of allies and partners. He would be more sympathetic to their interests and their concerns and solicitous of their input than President Trump has been. So I do think that's an important distinction, and I don't think it's merely rhetorical. I think it is in his temperament. A sense on the part of Vice President Biden that when the United States works with others, we benefit as well. It's a mutual benefit. Whereas I think the word to best describe President Trump's approach to allies and partners is transactional, right? So the president has measured the effectiveness of his policy towards allies and partners on the extent to which they have increased their military spending in response to American and his threats to cut them off if they don't. Again, I could spin a narrative that says that these countries were likely to invest greater resources in some military technology, but perhaps they were wiser to invest in other things that were more useful against, I don't know, an infectious disease, for example. So the debate over allied burden sharing, as I said, is not a new one. This is something that goes back to the founding of the NATO alliance and is a perennial debate. But I do think that a Biden administration would be more sympathetic and more inclined to work with allies and partners than President Trump has been or the Trump administration has been to a certain extent. I think just in general that if we believe that American allies and partners are a strength, are a force multiplier, and I believe that, then we have to see them not merely as liabilities, but also as assets. And I think that does mean relying more heavily on them to deal with problems in their own respective neighborhoods. That's something that I've emphasized throughout my academic scholarly career. And I think we're moving into an era where, this gets back to Professor Melkonian's question, that isn't merely desirable, but it's essential.
Okay, thank you. I think Dr. Eisenberg would like to ask a follow-up question here.
Yes, so just as I'm listening to all these, questions that are coming in to Chris, one of the things, and I think you would probably agree about this, is, one of the oddities of the period that we're in right now is that President Trump has basically infuriated the hawks in the United States. There have been any number of manifestations about, whether it's Bolton or, this whole group of national security people under Bush and other Republican administrations who've come out with this statement. There is a general sense that the problem with, coming from this very conservative direction is really that what's wrong with Trump is that he's been stupid, right? That thumbing his nose at allies has weakened us. But that also, a variety of steps that he's taken have been insufficiently tough, with enemies.
Correct.
And so I'm raising that because I think that also connects, and this is the concern I have, to this rising sense, which has come suddenly, like just exploded, that the United States is facing some enormous danger from Russia or from China,
Right.
which would necessitate us spending $1 zillion for all eternity.
Right.
And I'm not speaking now about the issue of, whether somebody's influencing our elections or not, which I think is personally very overblown. But there's this, that you've got this growing hawkish sentiment on the one hand, and you even have really the mainstream media acting like the Russians and the Chinese are like immense danger to us.
Right.
And I wonder if Chris would comment on that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that concerns me most about the discussion surrounding Russia and China over the last 3.5 or 4 years is how the Russia question has become increasingly polarized along partisan lines, whereas the China question has become less polarized along partisan lines. I'm worried about both of those things. In other words, I'm concerned that the Russia threat, such as it is increasingly filtered through a partisan lens, so that if you're a Republican, you're less likely to take it seriously, and you're a Democrat, you're more likely to take it seriously, and somewhere in the middle is probably the correct assessment. But meeting in the middle is not a strength of the American political system right now, so that's a problem. But I also am concerned about the rising bipartisan sentiment that China is a threat worth mobilizing the country to a full-scale Cold War. That's where I see this headed. I'm very worried about it. I think there are still sensible voices on both the left and the right that make the case for continued engagement with China, the importance of trade, diplomacy, and exchange. I think that's continuing. Those voices exist. They should be amplified as much as possible. That's something that I try to do. But I take your point, Carolyn, that this there is a tendency to inflate threats in general, but again, I'm more concerned about the sort of seeming bipartisan agreement on the China question, and I'm worried about the partisan divide on Russia, but for different reasons. It's really a reflection. The divide on Russia is really a reflection of our political polarization, which I think personally is the greatest threat to the republic, far more serious than that of foreign enemies.
Thank you. Let me just say here, Carolyn, can I go forward? Yeah, okay. We're getting a ton of questions in the chat and some very enthusiastic students. And I know one of my students just said I have a lot of questions. That is great. So Emma, Jay, Nicholas, thank you. I'm not going to be able to get to all of your questions, but I'm going to try to get to some.
And I'm going to do a better job of having shorter answers so we can get to more questions.
No, we have about 15 minutes. And Chris, I think something just happened with your slide, just so you know, some red lines came on. I don't know.
I saw that.
Yeah,
They're still, oh, they're there. See, they don't show up on my screen, but they show up on your screen. So, you know, I'm not sure what that's all about.
I don't know what that is, but okay. Well, we will try to
All
figure that out, everybody. But
All
in the meantime, I'd like to actually read this this question, which is in the chat to everyone, from Jay Fensterer, who thanks you for your service as an Army veteran with 2 tours in Iraq as well. Jay, thank you for your service. And Jay brings up a question that actually transitions us a little bit from foreign policy, from issues, right? Decisions about conflict, cooperation with Russia, China, other powers, to elections. And with the presidential debates beginning in 2 weeks, I think this is important to discuss. Says that, what are your thoughts about the presidential debates and the focus on the 2 major party candidates, namely Biden and Trump? If a candidate is on the ballot in all 50 states, should the candidates be on the debate stage, regardless of the 15% poll number rule, which is, of course, from the Commission on Presidential Debates?
Great question, Jay, and let me echo Nina's point. Thank you for your service. I think that the 2 major parties, they disagree on much, but they agree on maintaining a duopoly of the political system, and that is not to our benefit, that's to our detriment. Having said that, there are practical considerations with respect to the debates that would preclude, I guess your threshold is a reasonable one, that anyone on the ballot in all 50 states should certainly qualify. But I think there are practical concerns with allowing minor party candidates that have no reasonable prospect for victory and allowing them on the debate stage and giving less time to the 2 individuals who are most likely to prevail. I guess this is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, and trust me, I've thought about this at great length, because I think if third-party candidates got more exposure, and there is no greater exposure than the debates, then we might have a more serious third-party movement in this country. But the manner in which the political system is controlled by the 2 major parties makes it extremely difficult for third-party candidates to break in. This is just one manifestation of that. I've been intrigued by other approaches to increasing competition in political elections, things like ranked choice voting. I'm a big fan of that. And other approaches, open primaries, things like that, other approaches that allow for a more diverse viewpoints to be reflected in the political system. But as far as the debates go, I'm afraid that the 2 parties are in control and are likely to remain in control, and therefore will write the rules in such a way that virtually ensure that third-party candidates will not appear on the debate stage.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. A question that I just received from a student: if you discuss China's response to the COVID-19 crisis, and obviously there's kind of a debate in the United States about China's actions, and starting from the end of 2019 going forward, and how you think basically the kind of the domestic, right, consequences of the virus and consequences for U.S. foreign policy, particularly with respect to China.
Yeah, this is really a terrific question, because there are many different elements to this question. So there is an epidemiological question, which is how quickly did China discover the truth? Chinese officials and doctors discovered the truth about the virus. How forthcoming were they about the dangers? The answer is they knew, it seems, fairly quickly. They were not particularly forthcoming. They briefly but aggressively tried to stifle an open discussion about the dangers of the disease, and that was to the planet's detriment. It affected China initially first, but ultimately resulted in the disease spreading much more quickly and more widely, and us not knowing the details. At the same time, once the details were known, the particulars of the coronavirus and the sort of character of the disease were fairly quickly disseminated, and that was critical for developing reliable tests. And so once that information was released, those countries and those health institutions that took advantage of that information and acted swiftly, they were able to deal with this. And again, I think if you look at the response of America's allies and partners to the coronavirus relative to our own, it is a happy picture for our allies and partners, but less so for the United States. And let me be clear, this is a very difficult disease. Even countries that have handled the disease well have suffered greatly. So I think it would have been a difficult challenge no matter what. The other aspect of this question, though, that's important is recognizing how public sentiment in the United States has shifted so decisively and so quickly against China. And the answer is COVID. We know that Republican candidates for office were advised by a senior official in the RNC or a study commissioned by the RNC to focus attention on China's role in the spread of the virus, and that coincides with rising animosity and ill will towards China among the American people, which is now at its highest level since ever recorded. It's in the low 70s in terms of people who have a low opinion of China. To oversimplify, if you can't hug your grandmother, blame Beijing. I think that is an oversimplification to say the least, but I do think it is worth sort of pondering whether or not that actually serves our interests, both here in the United States and globally. Lastly, the question is how, if China has recovered far more quickly from the disease and they impose some extraordinarily draconian restrictions in order to do so, something that we in this country would not have tolerated, I think, correctly, does their ability to recover quickly put them in a great advantage relative to other countries that are still struggling with the disease? And on that question, I'm very skeptical of that. China is heavily dependent upon foreign trade, and so if other economies are suffering, it will be hard for the Chinese economy to recover quickly. I don't really see many people benefiting. In short, I don't see many people benefiting from coronavirus, and most people suffering. And that's why I think it's important for the world to come together on dealing with this challenge. The challenge right now before us, which is until an effective vaccine is developed, a safe and effective vaccine is developed, sharing information on therapeutics and treatment of the disease, and reducing and limiting its spread.
Thank you, Chris. I should say we are now in the final few minutes. The time is flying by, but students we have 11:10 classes, so we are going to have to conclude this promptly. Let me also say we are recording this. We will, the lecture will be posted later. We'll try to remove these red lines if we can. But at any rate, let me just ask at this point my colleagues, Professors Eisenberg, Melkonian, and Jensen, if there are any follow-ups you have or any questions you'd like to ask at this point.
I actually would like to do a follow-up.
Okay.
And I want, particularly to connect to a point Chris made earlier about the whole phenomenon whereby American militarism actually has the effect of generating enemies that you might not necessarily have had in the first place. And I guess I want to raise that particularly with respect to Russia, that part of the dynamic, I think, that was present, and I'm now going back to the moment when, as the Cold War is ending, under Presidents Reagan and Bush, that I wonder if part of the ability of the United States and Russia to come together in a more cooperative way was some understanding that the United States would not seek to take advantage of Russian concessions in a variety of ways, but that to some degree Russian leadership actually counted on those commitments. And I'm wondering to what extent, again, I want to sort of put aside the issue of election tampering. I wonder to what extent the tensions that we now have with Russia have to do with the fact that US leaders, and I put Bill Clinton into this, actually, instead of taking the ending of the Cold War as a moment to really change policy in some profound way, that what ended up happening is that American political leaders took the Russian concessions as an opportunity to try to increase our primacy or military advantage over, everybody. And so I'm wondering if we think about what's gone wrong in our relationship to Russia, if we get beyond Putin's personality, if that underlying dynamic of the quest for U.S. primacy isn't part of what's made this a big mess.
Carolyn, it's a terrific question, and I think you got at the heart of it. So much of the debate around U.S.-Russia relations revolves around Vladimir Putin. If you believe that Vladimir Putin was committed to reasserting Russian dominance, if you take him at his word that the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of recent history was the collapse of the Soviet Union, and therefore an expression of his desire to, in some fashion, reassemble the Soviet Union, if you believe that he will stop at nothing to defeat his domestic rivals and to expand Russian influence around the world, and we've seen tragically, dramatically evidence of that just in the last few weeks, then you don't believe that there is any potential grounds for cooperation and compromise between the United States and Putin's Russia. In other words, the problem of Putin's Russia is Putin. The alternative explanation is the problem of Putin's Russia is Russia, which is a sense of vulnerability and threat and danger that goes back hundreds of years. I believe you are correct that some of the sort of the early post-Cold War policymaking was mindful of Russian insecurities and tried to give assurances to the Russian leaders that coming out of the Soviet Union that the United States would be mindful of those assurances. It is one of the most hotly contested issues in sort of the scholarship of the period, as you probably know, and I think it's an unanswerable question, to be perfectly honest. When I reviewed this very recently, there were competing open letters on U.S.-Russia policy that we discussed on the Net Assessment podcast just a few weeks ago, and the critical difference between those two letters, between Americans who believe in sort of pushing for greater relations between the United States and Russia and those who believe that is impossible, the determining factor was Vladimir Putin. And if you believe that he is irreconcilable, then you cannot see the potential for better U.S. relations as long as he's leading Russia.
Somehow I got muted.
Could I just
No, Marty, you know what? We're actually we're closing up now. So I'm afraid I've got to, I know, because we do have to wrap up. So I'm going to ask Chris to wrap up with, Chris, kind of for our students, when we provide instruction, guidelines, things to look ahead.
Yep.
The title of your talk was U.S. Foreign Policy Before and After the Election. Could you conclude with us,
Sure.
for us, with kind of a list of what you would say the top 3 priorities are for the United States? Not what political realities are, but what, just focusing on national interest,
Sure.
away from election
Sure.
politics. What do we need to do?
Look, that's an excellent question, and it's a very simple one. The top 3 priorities are priorities. I'm not trying to be cute. The United States has numerous urgent challenges, both here and abroad, and we cannot do everything all at the same time. As it was famously said, he who defends everything defends nothing. We must make some difficult choices. Fortunately, and I do believe it is a fortunate circumstance, we do have allies and partners that we can rely on and work with in ways that we didn't in the past. We need to identify those areas of agreement and common interest. We need to work with them. We need to share the burdens, in some case, shift the burdens to others, because we are going to have some very serious challenges to deal with here at home. So the number one, my number one piece of advice, and the number one thing that I would urge everyone to look at is, does the next U.S. national security strategy, whether it's written by the Biden administration or a second Trump administration, does it set priorities? Or does it lay out a laundry list of things that we must deal with, all of equal importance? If it is the latter, then it is not a strategy. Strategy is about choices. And my main complaint of U.S. foreign policy over the last 20 years is an unwillingness to admit to the need to make hard choices.
Okay. I think that is actually a very kind of a sobering, but also very action-oriented note for all of us in academia and in policy, the need to think about, raise questions, costs, benefits, resources, interests, and choices. We very much appreciate you taking the time, Chris. We look forward to welcoming you back to campus
I
in
look forward to it.
post-election, but for now, everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Preble for a most informative session. Thank you very much. We are going to close the session now. We will, we do plan to make the chat, we do plan to make this available online in the next few days. And I believe we will get a notification of that when that happens. But for now, thank you, everyone. Have a great day.